Hello, and welcome back to the What They Left Behind podcast. I'm your host, Katie, professional genealogist, and today I thought we'd take a little break from deep dives and I'd tell you all a little about my journey into genealogy and what my hopes are for this podcast. I realized one of my favorite things about listening to some of my favorite podcasts is getting to know the hosts some, which is a lot easier when there are multiple hosts who can chat and go on tangents and rag on each other. And on that note, I am hoping to have some guests on for episodes in the not too distant future, but since my episodes are pretty research heavy, there's not a lot of time for that kind of banter. So here's a little about me. I was born in Portland, Maine, and I live near Bangor today. Yes, it is pronounced Bangor, not Bangor, no matter what Google tells you. Growing up, I loved mysteries and horses and reading. I went through a phase in about 5th grade when I was determined to be a detective. I loved the idea of looking for clues and uncovering secrets. Little did I know what I would stumble into as an adult. Then, in 2003, Pirates of the Caribbean released, and as many kids, I went through a pirate phase. It was probably at Christmas that year, my dad's parents told me that we were related to a pirate, or rather a privateer, as I was told, Jean Lafitte. He and his brother Pierre led the Baratarians, a group of smugglers and pirates who operated off the coast of New Orleans. This same conversation also revealed more family lore from my dad's ancestors. Not only were we related to a privateer, but they also claimed relation to Napoleon Bonaparte through his brother Jerome, and claimed a great something grandmother named Penelope was the cause of the slight color change partway up the Washington Monument, that when the government didn't pay her for her initial shipment of marble, she blasted her quarry shut, preventing any further mining. So far, I've found no evidence that Penelope ever owned the quarry that provided stone to the Washington Monument, though some of it did seem to come from the town she lived in, but I'm still digging into that lore to find out where the story might have originated. These things tend to become exaggerated as they're passed down, and usually have some kernel of truth somewhere down the line. Thus far, I've found no direct relation to Napoleon Bonaparte or his brother, but his brother's wife, Betsy Patterson, did run in the same social circles as my Baltimore ancestors, and some are even buried in the same cemetery. Not a close connection, but certainly one that could have spawned the lore I heard growing up. As for Jean Lafitte, I have found several connections, but none of them genetic. I'll save the details for another episode since I want to do it justice. These stories were among the first seeds that grew into my love for genealogy. In school, I wasn't particularly interested in history. Memorizing names and dates just wasn't my forte, and even now, though I'm confident in my research, I often have to refer visually to my tree when talking about relatives. Today, history podcasts are some of my favorites, but I've found that episodes tell stories. They don't just list out dates of battles and laws. It's stories that make us human, I think. Language, yes, but other species communicate with sounds and body language. We're the only ones who tell stories, who not only use language to remember our past, but to explain the world around us and express commentary and to escape reality temporarily. Once I became invested in my own family history, world history became much more interesting to me. I wanted the context of my ancestors' lives. What made them make the decisions they did? What made them immigrate to the U.S.? What was the world like for them? But I'm getting ahead of myself. In 2017, a number of life changes threw me into a bit of an existential crisis. Among other things, I got engaged to my now husband, hi Josh, and we began discussing more seriously whether or not we wanted to have kids. I'd grown up going to church, and there was a huge focus in the Bible studies and youth groups I went to on being a good wife and mother. Though I'd taken a step back from that community, there was still a deep sense of duty there I had to unpack and examine. I was doing a lot of deconstruction at that time, though I didn't know that name for it. Growing up in church, there was an emphasis on becoming a wife. This obviously is an oversimplification and might not be everyone's experience, but it was mine. After I got engaged, there was a sort of loss of direction. Okay, I did this thing that I've spent most of my life preparing for. I've caught myself a husband. I'm going to be a wife. Now what? Saying this out loud sounds really silly, but I got a similar feeling around the time I graduated high school. I was top of my class. I got into a good college with a good scholarship. The thing I'd spent the last 4 years or more focusing on had come to pass. Now what? Who am I if I'm not pursuing this goal? Obviously, life isn't supposed to be just checking off experiences like a to-do list, but there are certain ones that are made so big in our own communities that we're told for so long will affect the course of our life that it's hard not to stop and evaluate where you've been and where you're headed once you meet one of these milestones. So, in this existential soup of my changing identity, I began to wonder, if I don't have kids, who will remember me when I die? Cheerful, right? I think wanting to be remembered is probably a fairly universal desire. Look, I don't want a statue or anything, but I am a Leo and I have started a podcast, so maybe I haven't fully worked through this yet. It's kind of endearing that humans are so small and unimportant in the grand scheme of the universe, and yet we have this desire to remember and be remembered and to have an impact. While I was processing this through, I came across a quote by George Eliot that says, "Our dead are never dead to us until we have forgotten them." And I found that in the act of remembering my own ancestors, especially the ones whose branches stopped with them, was a way I could soothe my own sense of mortality. Fun fact, George Eliot is actually a pen name for a woman named Mary Ann Evans. She was born in 1819 in Nuneaton, a market town in Warwickshire, England, and she led a somewhat unconventional life. Her father ensured her education until she was about 16 when her mother died, and she came home to keep house. Later in life, she defied society by moving in with a married man, he himself having his own wife moved in with another man whom she'd fallen in love with. His name was George Lewes, and she used his first name as her pen name because she believed publishing under her own name would ensure she wasn't taken seriously. And she chose Eliot because it, quote, was a good mouth-filling, easily pronounced word. She and George considered themselves married, though no law connected them, and it wasn't until after his death in 1878 that she took her first legal husband. In 1880, she married her good friend John Cross, who was 20 years her junior and notoriously attempted suicide on their honeymoon. He supposedly jumped off their hotel balcony into the Grand Canal in Venice, where he was fished out by canal workers and gondolas, and the two returned to England, where Mary Ann died less than 6 months later at the age of 61. It sounds as though John's mental health and circumstances did improve. He never remarried, but he did live to be 84 years old. Okay, back from my tangent on George Eliot. It was at this point that I started seriously researching my own family on Ancestry.com. I got the free 2-week trial and bathed in the dopamine of expanding my tree and accepting hints. I made all the first-time researcher errors of adding all the member tree hints and attaching any sources that looked like they matched. But when my free trial ended, I found I still had questions. I was hooked. Over the next several years, I explored my tree and my husband's in my free time. And when I regularly found myself losing track of time and staying up past midnight, I began to wonder if I could make it a larger part of my life. I began researching friends' trees with permission to try to get a wider range of experience, and when the pandemic hit in 2020, I discovered how much I enjoyed working from home. I signed up for an online class through Boston University, and then later a certificate course through IAP Career College. My bachelor's degree in business management was also helpful as I made a website, formed a sole proprietorship, and finally quit my toxic office job in spring of 2021. Many of my clients were hoping to rediscover their cultures and traditions, and in some sense, identity. It was rewarding and exciting to help them do so as much as I could. Every tree I embarked on gave me the opportunity to learn more about different regions, different cultures, and different research processes. And being self-employed meant I could structure my days to accommodate my good days and bad days. I could work late into the night when I was on a roll and sleep in without getting a demerit for tardiness. I could take a day off when a migraine hit without feeling badly for leaving coworkers without support, but then the migraine started getting more frequent. The post-migraine brain fog was lasting longer. And I was also experiencing one of the downsides of self-employment: no health insurance. So with limited funds for medical testing, we tried a few preventative medications without any luck, and I found the only thing that really helped was rest. I cut back on my work hours and I slept a lot. It was the only thing I could do during a migraine. I did my own extensive research and found I was probably dealing with burnout. I'd been spit out of the classic gifted and talented kid pipeline, and I had to find a way to recover and function without stressing myself into more migraines. I'm back to 1 or 2 days a month of the migraine monster, and this podcast is sort of my personal project to supplement my client research. I'll be honest, I am hoping to start a Patreon to help pay for better equipment and to take episode requests and maybe share family recipes and bonus content. I haven't quite settled on what that might look like yet, but it's in the works. So, what are my goals for this podcast? Well, I'm hoping to continue to deep dive into family history adjacent topics. Things like what to know before you take a commercial DNA test. What's the deal with inherited family trauma? What happened to the 1890 U.S. Census? How do the U.S. fertility and adoption industries affect family research, cultural identity, and medical history? What do I do if I find out my ancestors were enslavers or were involved in the transatlantic slave trade? Acknowledging the history of white supremacy and eugenics within genealogy and how to avoid those same mistakes. How can we respectfully and mindfully relate to and reclaim cultural identities that have been lost to assimilation and whitewashing? And what if I don't particularly like my ancestors? And so much more. Some of these are bigger concepts than others, but I think they're important to explore. As always, I'm simply here to present my own perspective and hope to learn alongside you all. Some of these topics are ones I don't feel comfortable addressing or advising on by myself, and I've begun looking for experts who might be able to shed some light and share their thoughts on topics a white woman shouldn't tackle alone. I want this podcast to be insightful and thoughtful and meaningful and educational, but not boring. It's going to be a journey, and I hope it's one that will be helpful or at least thought-provoking for my listeners. I appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you for sticking around for a more personal episode. I'll be back in 2 weeks with something new for you. As always, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Not Forgotten Genealogy. And if you have any comments, questions, ideas, thoughts, concerns, you can email me at notforgottengenealogy@gmail.com. If you're enjoying the show, please give it 5 stars on whatever platform you listen on and consider sharing with a friend or loved one. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.